Thanks everybody for coming. It's great to see such high attendance. I hope you find this interesting. So as Gloriana was saying, I am a lecturer in the I'm in the computer science department at Bristol, and I'm part of the cybersecurity group there. And my research interests are all around understanding adversarial behaviors, which is a big catch-all term that I use to indicate a lot of things, including cybercrime, online fraud, social engineering, and other kinds of malicious action that takes place online. So including things like advertisers targeting people, and also things like bias in news sources, for example. So that's a big net that I cast, and I look for interesting things. And one of the interesting things, which I'm going to talk about now, is dating fraud. And so the research I'm going to explain is part of a project that we did a couple of years, well, a year ago, I think we finally finished. No, a whole 2 years ago, because 2020 did happen, and it is not just a kind of passing couple of months. Yeah, two years ago now. So this is work that we did in combination with some colleagues from University College London and Monica Whitty, who was, at the time I wrote these slides, in the University of Warwick, although she's since moved to the University of Melbourne in Australia. So, in fact, most of the people on that list have changed their affiliation. That cover slide was written in 2019, so I've given a version of this talk before, but I'm going to expand it and add a little bit on the end to talk about what we've kind of been doing since. Okay, so dating fraud. So if you've been on an online dating website, there's a chance that you might have encountered this problem before. But if you haven't, I'm just going to kind of walk you through what happens here. So you're on a dating website and you encounter either of these two potentially attractive people. So there is this pretty young woman here from Minnesota who's a beautician and she's single. And there is this chap here who is very respectable looking, and he's in the military, and he's unfortunately lost his wife at some point. These people, you might get into a conversation with them, so you might approach them on a dating site and start chatting, as the dating site encourages you to do. And what you will find happens is you very quickly fall into a relationship, which is great, because that's what you want to do on a dating site. You want to find a relationship and start one off. So you will be exchanging lots of messages with these people. Quite often, these people will not leave you alone. So there'll be a high degree of contact, continuous contact with the person on the other end. They will move through the stages of attraction. In a typical dating relationship, you have a few dates before you go any further. You move slowly towards commitments. They will kind of bulldoze straight through all of that. They'll very quickly proclaim themselves to be in love with you and expect you to reciprocate. And at some point during the relationship, when you appear to be actually reciprocating their feelings, there'll be a problem. So it may be that the pretty young woman that you're talking to will say that her laptop is broken and she's not going to be able to talk to you until she manages to get it fixed. And there'll be a hint that maybe you could do something to help her. Maybe you could send her some money to help get her laptop fixed. Or you could just send her a laptop. That would work as well. And it could very well be that your attractive, handsome chap who has gone overseas briefly because he's got some business, because he's a very professional guy, has been mugged or had something stolen from him, and he's trapped in a foreign country, and he needs some help getting out. And of course, what's happening here is this is all a lie. None of the relationship was real, in the sense that the person you're talking to was not the person that you thought it was. And the fictitious event that has thrown up a hurdle in your relationship is fictitious. It's an invention to get money out of you. And if you do send money or goods, which can then be sold for money, to these people, what will happen is the relationship will continue. More hurdles will be thrown up. It's very rare that they will agree to it's very rare that you will actually meet anyone, but you may find yourself sometimes paying for plane tickets for them to come to the country. There'll be a series of ongoing attempts to drain money from you, and these will be ruthless. So if at any point you start expressing some doubts about the person that you're talking to, then you will be exposed to emotional blackmail. So they will talk about how hard their life is, about the situation that you're kind of ignoring, how that's making things really terrible for them. They might threaten suicide. Remember again that this is someone that you think you're in a relationship with. So this can be pretty horrible to people. And this is how online dating fraud works. So there are two major reasons that we care about online dating fraud. One is that there is quite obviously a lot of emotional harm caused by this, caused by the impact on the victims of this. And it's incredibly difficult actually for people who are intervening in these cases to even convince the victims of romance fraud that they are victims, that the person on the other end is not really in a relationship with them. Even when you can point to specific instances where they have lied, where they are obviously taking advantage of the victim. The victim might acknowledge some bad behavior on the part of the person that they're talking to, that they think they're in a relationship with, but they will still profess a belief that this is a real relationship, that the person really cares for them, even if they have scammed them out of money, which is of course a lie. And this just shows how dangerous this kind of fraud can be, because people form really strong attachments through these online relationships. Prying those attachments apart is very difficult and very painful for the victims. And of course, there is also the financial losses. So people can lose substantial sums on these relationships. So if you're sending hundreds, thousands of pounds overseas on a regular basis, it very quickly becomes quite taxing on people. And the scammers are ruthless about this as well. So even if you don't actually have money that you can send them, if your objection is not that you don't believe them, or that you don't care about your partner's situation, even if that's the objection that you throw up, they will often say, well, I mean, you could take out a loan, you could sell your car. So they will actually quite consciously advocate that their victims dig themselves into financial difficulty in order to send them money. So these are two major categories of harm that come out of dating fraud. So a typical approach to detecting some kind of misbehavior in platforms like online dating sites would look at the behavior of the accounts of people that you want to stop committing fraud. But the problem that we have is that online dating fraudsters act a lot like real users. So these scammers lie on their profile, so they tend to be someone that they're not. They'll contact lots of users because they want to hook a good victim, and they will quickly seek to move conversations off the platform to a different medium where the connection between the two parties can not be observed by the dating site. And these are unfortunately also the common behaviors of real users of dating sites. So real users of dating sites don't lie completely about their identity, but they may blur the truth a little bit on their dating site profile. Maybe the picture that they've uploaded isn't actually a very recent picture. Maybe the age details are fudged. Maybe they really can't deadlift as much weight as they claim. So there is inaccuracy in real user profiles. Real users also contact lots of users because they're looking for love. This is a gendered phenomenon. So the thing that we see is on most dating sites, men are contacting lots and lots of women, because they get very few responses. So there's a nuance to that. But also, real users want to move conversations off dating platforms. You don't want to still be in a relationship with someone purely through OkCupid or Tinder. You would move this to off some different messaging platform at some point during a relationship, because that makes it more real. It's no longer in the dating site's purview. There's no reason for the dating site to still have a lens into your relationship. So, because the behaviors of the scammers and real users are so similar, what we decided to do in this project was look at the way the scammers present themselves in the initial profile. So on their dating site profile, how does that profile differ from the real users' dating site profiles? Are there tells in there that can tell us that this looks like it's actually a scammer? So what we did is we found a dating site, Dating and More, which did preemptive screening of everyone that registered to it. So these are people with some experience dealing with dating fraud, and they screen incoming profiles to identify ones that they think are scammers. This is a small dating site, so it's not one of the big ones. It's unlikely that you guys have seen it or used it, but it's useful to us for this research, because they also list the scammers who unsuccessfully tried to register on the site on a separate scam list site, which includes all of the profile details that the scammers try to use. So we have human experts, which are essentially filtering the population. So we can't claim that they're perfect. So maybe they do sometimes let a scammer in if they're more sophisticated, but they definitely are able to separate out at least some of the scammers. And we have then a population of, so far as human experts can determine, real users, and as far as human experts can determine, scam users. So we collected data from both of these sites. We collected dating profiles from the Dating and More site and the scammer profiles from the Scam Diggers scam list. And when we say profile, there's a few different categories of information in there. So within a profile, you often have categorical information. So the age, gender, or ethnicity, information associated with the profile. So when people tell you, how old they are, etc. So demographics, we bundled these together as some of the categorical information about a user. There are also images. So at least one image, usually for a user of a dating site. Users typically include a picture of their face, but also a picture that in some way illustrates their personality. There's a lot of images of them doing things that they would maybe like to do with a partner. And as well as images, there's textual description. So this is where they essentially advertise themselves. So this is the pitch, as well as the demographics, which tell you some kind of basic information about a person. This is where you give some kind of sense of your personality to someone who's just browsing the website. So these are the kinds of information that we have. So the first question we asked ourselves is, how do the scammer profiles differ from the real profiles? And we did this by looking at a bunch of different traits from the profiles. So here's perhaps an instructive example for some of the data science students. So we have the average age of real profiles is 40, and the average age for the scam profiles is also 40. So you might think, right, so age is not much of a distinguishing factor between the scammers and the real users, which is true in the sense that if you just look at overall population. But if you look at the interaction with gender, then the average age of male and female profiles in real population is about the same. So they're both aged about 40. So this dating site is on the upper end of the age scale. So something like Tinder, probably you would find a lower age range. But real users, you have an average of 40 in male and female, whereas scam users have differences. So the average age for male profiles from scammers is about 50, and the average age of female profiles from scammers is about 30. And this obviously averages out to 40. And this shows something. So this shows that the scammers actually understand gendered dating preferences. So there's robust psychological literature that essentially, on average, men are much happier with younger partners, and females are happier with older partners. So there is gendered dating preferences, which the scammers are leveraging their understanding of. So they create older male profiles because they feel they'll be more successful, and they create younger female profiles because feel they'll be more successful. When targeting, obviously, the average age range here of about 40. We looked also at some of the other demographic characteristics. So on the left here, we have ethnicity, so self-reported ethnicity in the profile. And we see that white dominates for scam users as well as real users. And this makes sense because most of the victims or intended victims of the scammers are white. So it makes sense that the people attempting to target them would also pretend to be white. However, there's an interesting difference when you come to the second row. So the dating site has a large Hispanic population. So about 30% of the population identifies as Hispanic, so from the southern US and some of Latin America. But very few scam users give this ethnicity. So it seems to show that the scam users aren't targeting this population. So they're targeting white, mostly American victims, and they're ignoring other racial categories to a large extent. The second highest population of scam profiles when it comes to ethnicity was Native American, which is a very strange result. And this is particularly strange because the real amongst the real users, Native American was 0.01. So very small, 1% of the data on in the real dating sites. We're not sure what's going on here. One hypothesis that we have is that some of the scammers don't really understand what Native American means. So they may be thinking that Native American actually means that the user is a Native American. So they're thinking a member of the United States. The other option is that it's some kind of very calculated appeal to a certain demographic, but we're not entirely sure. It's an interesting result that we found out of our data. Looking at the right, the table on marital status. So as you might expect, single is a dominant category, and the scammers hit this at roughly the same proportion as the real users. When it comes to the other categories, scammers are less likely to use certain marital statuses than they appear in the actual data. So scammers have no interest in appearing or registering on a dating site with a profile that says they are married or in a relationship, because that's not going to attract many victims. They're also much less likely than the real population to list separated, and significantly less likely to list divorced. So they don't view these marital statuses as useful to them in attracting targets. However, they do find widowed to be a useful attractor for targets. This is typically a gendered thing. So scammers using the widowed status, typically they are presenting as male. So they create a profile that is an older male who is widowed, and this is used as part of a ploy. So it garners some sympathy from their target population, which is slightly younger women who may feel some sympathy for a man who has lost his wife. And this ties into a whole story that they will feed their victims if they're approached. So that's ethnicity and marital status. We also looked at the occupation that the scammer profiles offered. So there are a few interesting points that come out of this, and dividing again by male and female profiles presents some different results. So we see amongst the scammer male population, military and engineer were some of the largest categories of occupation. So military scams are a well-known phenomenon. There's a lot of appeal in pretending to be part of the military. And so we're not too surprised to see that. A lot of the other ones that appear on this list, the topmost categories for male profile among scammers, are quite masculine businesses. So engineering is again quite a masculine field typically, and there are also occupations which lend themselves to an explanation for why someone would be overseas. So why someone might end up trapped in a foreign country, why someone might not be able to actually come, and take you out on a date in the typical manner, and the relatively high status. So that seems to be what they're going for with their occupation, that they're going for an occupation that explains why they're away, remains relatively high status, and is quite coded in a kind of typical masculine manner. Female occupations are quite different. So when you look at the real and the scam female occupations, they're not all that dissimilar, with a couple of exceptions. So you see that the top couple of occupations in both cases are including things like student, carer, working in the service industry is in there, sales. So they're a lot closer to what you maybe would expect for female profiles on these dating sites. We do see a couple of interesting anomalies. So fashion is much more common than you might expect. So fashion was quite rare in the real data. This is because fashion is a category that includes things like model, and pretending to be a model of some kind has an appeal effect. We also saw a relatively strange phenomenon, which was scam profiles, so female scam profiles that claim to be in the military. And we saw no real dating site profiles that claim to be in the military. This was kind of an unusual spike. And we're not exactly sure what's going on there, but it seems to be that what happens here is the scammers are reusing some of the profile material from when they're creating male profiles, and they're not always very careful. So sometimes they're kind of copying and pasting things from different kind of scams that they're running, and they're leaving some things in that should be in the male profile. That's our hypothesis anyway to explain some of these. Okay, so that was demographics. Now for the slightly more visual part. So looking at the images. All of these images are real scammer dating site profile images. I absolutely love some of these. Okay, so the guy at the top, this is relatively well done. So all of these images, they've actually photoshopped in the face of the person that they are pretending to be onto an image that's got the context that they want to exploit. So the guy at the top is actually not, he doesn't actually look like that. So if you can search for the actual root image, and it's a different person sitting at that desk in the uniform. They just have one person's face, and they've got a bunch of different contexts that they want to insert him into. So they photoshopped his face into that situation because, of course, they're claiming to be a member of the military. So that makes perfect sense. The one next to that, the one in the hospital. So this is a common scam. So they will claim to. Oh, I see a question. Stephen. So Stephen's asking what happens when a scammer uses an image proffered from a real profile, and that definitely does happen. So a lot of these images are stolen, and in fact, they use packs of images that they've scraped from social networking sites, etc. So we're talking here about these ones where they've actually replaced the faces. Sometimes they don't do that. Sometimes they just pretend to be someone because they've got a lot of images of them. And of course, the person whose head was chopped into this picture was actually, he's a real person out there, and he's not a scammer. It's just a person that they have a few different pictures of. It is a big problem. So that's actually a thing that we're exploring currently at the moment. So we're looking at if we can identify when a image that is appearing on a dating site is connected with a name that is not the name that this image is connected with elsewhere on the internet. So to see if we can find this kind of interesting contradiction. So that definitely does happen. So thanks for bringing that up. So the image on the right here, it's not even a really good Photoshop. So the head, if you have a look at it, is really, it looks almost 3D, like it's just a model that they've inserted onto this image. It's quite a poor Photoshop. This story, so the story that they've had an accident, they're in hospital and they need help, is of course used for kind of emotional leverage as part of the relationship. So you can see why that image would be attractive, so that they want this context, but they're not always extremely good at photoshopping. The image that is slightly pixelated here, but the image below the guy at the desk, here, of course, they're trying to pretend that they're a doctor, so they're trying to pretend that that this context reflects them. They don't really understand some of the images that they're extracting there. So if you look at the people behind the guy in the front whose face has been swapped out, you may notice some famous actors, because this is actually an image from the, I think it's Green Room is the TV show. So David Mitchell is sitting behind the guy that this person is pretending to be. So they're pretending that they're a real doctor, but they've actually used a picture from a TV show as their context. And also, of course, you see the educational context on the other side. So they're pretending to be a student, and so they've just swapped someone's picture into a situation where someone's obviously graduating. Although it's a bit strange that you would have a graduation picture on your dating site, but I don't know, maybe people do. So one of the things that you notice, of course, here is that the context around the face is sometimes important. And this is a thing that we exploited a little further in when we were building classifiers to distinguish between scammers and real users. So we used, so they also just take them from the internet. So these faces that they want are people that they want. They have maybe a variety of expressions. Maybe they just think that they've got a good face, a honest face. So there's a few characteristics like that they look for, and then they just kind of put them into a lot of different contexts. There are actually people that supply the scammers, so they will create packs of images, essentially doing this. So they'll do this work of shopping these faces into a load of relevant contexts and handing them over to scammers so they can use them as part of a story. So the context here is the important thing. And what we did with these images is we actually used a common objects in context image description approach to extract the context from these images. So we trained a image description model that would describe each of the images. So here it would say something like, man in an army uniform sitting at a desk, a doctor in a hospital room or something like that. So we trained a model that could automatically do this, and then we used the text that this model output to get features that we could use to understand the context in the images and how that related to the scammer versus real user discrimination task. And of course, there's the text. So I'm always a bit baffled by this quote. This is a real quote from a scammer profile. To find a woman who loves to dance would be a miracle, but not impossible. I believe, even if rare, but definitely a bonus, but not a requirement. Lol, I also love a man who knows how to treat a woman like a baby and a baby like a woman. That's a real quote that they're using to advertise their profile. It's somehow baffling. There's a lot of positive sentiment, I guess, in there. So you see a kind of general upbeat attitude, even if it doesn't make a lot of sense. Yeah, we see a lot of interesting things like this. But on a kind of broader level, if we analyze the text that scammers use in their profiles, scammers produce a lot more words per profile. So this is congruent with some things that we know from psychology about liars. So liars tend to write more than people who are being honest because they feel the need to fill in additional detail. The scammers also make a lot more reference to emotion. So this is something that we have seen in limited observation of actual conversations between scammers and victims. So that they will use a lot more emotive language, but it also shows up in their profile descriptions. And they reference topics like family. So they reference perhaps the idea that they want a family, and they focus a lot on this kind of quite pushy in a way, formal language. So they will say things, yeah. Okay, so they definitely have a lot more confidence in the way they present themselves. So they almost have a pitch that they love you specifically in their profile, even though it doesn't make much sense. And they use some archaisms, so things that we wouldn't usually use in a kind of casual dating setting, just because of how Nigerian English perhaps differs a little bit from UK or US English. Real users talk a lot more about what they're interested in, their ambitions, their work, the things they like to do in leisure. So that we see a kind of a difference. The scammers are very much more in a kind of romantic writing genre than real users. Real users talk more about themselves in a kind of holistic manner, whereas scammers are very much talking about romance. So it's an interesting distinction between how we're approaching the task of finding someone that to fall in love with. Okay, so I've covered a few of the different profile elements. What we did in the project is we were building a classifier to distinguish between real users and scam users using our dataset, and we took an ensemble classification approach. So essentially, we split up the problem between 3 different researchers who worked on different individual classifiers. So I took the demographics, our colleague at UCL took the images, and Claudia Piersman, who's also a Lancaster graduate, took the descriptions. There was a range of pre-processing that had to be done. So normalization of some of the data in the demographic case. Within the images, as I just mentioned, we described the images automatically. And for the text, we used a n-gram extraction approach, so transforming the data into a series of standardized, I think, trigrams in the end, in order to then each individually come up with a model that was able to make a prediction about whether or not a profile was a scammer or a real user. as part of this process, what we did is we divided up our data set. So we had a certain amount of data for training the individual classifiers, 60%. We then had validation set where we calibrated the ensemble model. So each of these classifiers had a certain accuracy, and the ensemble model learned to the extent it could when it could trust, say, the demographics classifier over the image classifier, and how much relatively to weight each of their probability outputs. And that's what we used another 20% of the data for. And then finally, we had 20% of the data held out for our final results. So understand exactly how well our classifier could perform on data that neither it nor its constituent classifiers had seen. So here's the confusion matrix and stats for the accuracy. So there's a little bit of competition between each of us on the individual classifiers to see how well they would work. I didn't win, unfortunately. So the demographics had an F1 of 84.0, and the descriptions classifier had an F1 of 84.2. So it's pretty close. Both of them were relatively evenly weighted when it comes to precision and recall. The captions, which is the captions of the images classifier, had lower F1 prediction accuracy, or lower F1 prediction accuracy overall, but it was quite useful because it was extremely precise. So it very rarely made false positive decisions. And this is quite useful to our ensemble. We tried a couple of ensembles. So one of them was we just had the classifiers vote simply between them. So if two of the classifiers produced a decision, then that was the decision that the ensemble went with. And we also had the tuned weighted vote, which was the result of the validation stage that I described. And the weighted vote classifier outperformed the simple voter. We got up to a F1 of 94.5. So yeah, we were pretty happy with that result. We did also actually throw all the features into a single classifier just to see if we weren't making more work out of this than it needed to. But the weighted vote classifier, the models in the ensemble, yeah. So it's the three: the demographics, captions, and description. Or were you talking about the type of model? So it was, I believe, yes, it was an SVM. I cannot remember the kernel function though. The images, so the images were described and studied using NLP. They weren't used directly. We didn't feel that we had enough. So our sample size is not really big enough to make the kind of pixel level distinctions. So that's why we kind of resolved things down to that view. They weren't described manually. They were described by the common object in context model. Thanks, Gloriana. Do we do a qualitative analysis? Yes. So my very next slide, error analysis. Yeah, okay. So there's a few questions coming in, so I'm going to get onto the error analysis first, and then I'll come back to the other ones. Okay, so one of the things that we had that was really good for us is we had human judgments that were used to separate the data. And we also understand, because when the moderators decide that a profile is a scammer, they say why they think it's a scammer. So they give a set of particular reasons. So they select a few different reasons that they think that a profile is a scammer. And that was really useful for us because it let us look. Firstly, we could compare our performance against the performance of the human moderators. Of course, we can only do recall because we can't look at precision in that context. But we can look at how well we're doing against individual reasons that moderators give. So we can see, is there a type of thing that humans can do that our model is currently not doing very well? So you'll remember that the weighted vote ensemble had a recall of 93. So what we're looking for here is areas where our recall against a particular reason drops below 93, because that seems to indicate that we're not capturing as many of profiles identified through this method by humans with our automatic model. And mostly we do fine. So for our reasons that humans give, like the IP address contradicts the location, so that someone's claiming to say be in the US and their IP address comes from Nigeria, we're fine. And also for things like suspicious language use. So it seems like our classifier understands what suspicious language is. So the description classifier is doing well enough there. And for a bunch of other things like this, we do fine. One thing that we weren't doing as well on, I mean, it's not too concerning, but it was a little lower, was the reason that the moderators give, which is the IP address is suspicious. And so this is a moderator's judgment that certain origins for dating site kind of registrations are worth flagging anyway, because this is commonly where scammers seem to operate from. And that was something that we really wanted to follow up and understand in more detail. So we did. So we wanted to learn about the suspicious locations in online dating fraud. And we did a whole analysis that just dug into what we could learn about the locations that these scam profiles come from. So here's a little map that lets you see some of the data that we have. So it may be a bad decision actually to use red for real profiles and blue for scam profiles, because I always look at it and think the other way around would make more sense. But you can see that the scam profiles, they originate, or they claim to, this is claimed locations in the scammer profile and not their actual location. So they mostly try to say that they're in the US. There is a focus in the UK as well, and a little bit in Germany. And there are a couple of other ones which are interesting because they come from places where we don't see real profiles. We're interested in this question for a few reasons. Firstly, just to follow up the error analysis that we're doing, but also because understanding the kind of geographical origins of dating fraud could help us improve technical countermeasures at dating sites. If there is a reason to be suspicious of logins from particular locations, then that's something that could be automated. And also at a kind of broader level, if we need to target anti-fraud campaigns on a kind of international level, we need to know where we need to target them. And also there's a diagnostic effect. So if we can understand that particular types of dating fraud come from particular locations, they maybe could be useful for investigations. That understanding could maybe be useful for an investigator. We, of course, only have a relatively small amount of data to investigate this question. So we have 5,000 scam profiles. If we inspect the IP addresses, a large number of them are proxied, which is what you might expect for scammers. But we do have some that don't appear to be proxied. So we have about 1,600 scam profiles that don't seem to come from proxied connections. Other issues, of course, we should always bear in mind, this is not a large dating site. There might be some biases in the types of scammers that are attracted to this dating site. And there might be some biases in how well we can identify whether or not the IP address is actually a source IP address rather than a proxy. But moving on from those, one of the things we did was we wanted to see if we could improve on this by finding connections between some of the source IP addresses. So the ones where we know that, well, we suspect that they're not a proxied connection, and the ones that we know are proxied connections, to see if any of the proxied connections can be linked based on textual overlap and perhaps the use of the same images to locations from the source side of the data. So essentially what we're doing here is we've got some dating profiles which we know, or we can say with relative confidence where they're from, and we have some that we don't know where they're from, and we're looking at matching ones that we don't know where they're from to other profiles where we do know where they're from to say, okay, this adds some weight to our understanding of where profiles seem to be coming from. We did a comparison here. So this map is mapping where the IP address that a profile originated from is to the place that they say in their dating profile that they are. So you'll see, of course, a massive interest in people from across the world saying that they're in the US. The second largest one there is the UK. So as far as targeting, the UK is the second most targeted location in our data set. And there are a few interesting outliers, such as Ukraine and Russia, where they actually are from where they say they are. So they claim to be in Russia, and as far as we can tell, they are in Russia. So a very quick whistle-stop tour of the geographic origins of dating fraud and some of the characteristics involved. Africa was a very big origin for dating fraud. So the largest single origin that we have, based on IP address information, is Nigeria. About 30% of all dating fraud in our data set comes from Nigeria. And so we discovered actually that countries tend to lean in a particular direction. So they either produce mostly male or mostly female profiles. So there seems to be distinctive kind of approaches to dating fraud based on the national origins. So Nigeria was quite heavily male. So 73% of the dating fraud profiles coming out of Nigeria were pretending to be males. Ghana was, well, actually it kind of bucked a trend. So it was relatively balanced in terms of male and female profiles. And it was unusual in that we saw a lot of honest locations. So that's that, they say that they're in Ghana. There are a couple of reasons they might do this. One of them is that they might want to get around the comparison that the dating site moderators are doing between the IP address and the claimed location. So if they know that the dating site moderators are checking that the IP address matches the location that they're coming from, and they don't have the ability to impersonate a different location through proxying, then they might just claim that they're from Ghana. And there is a way to do essentially dating fraud where you're a lot more honest about it, where you claim to be quite essentially poor, and you need someone somewhere else in the world to support you financially as part of a romantic relationship. And that seems to be something that some people in Ghana at least took up. South Africa was quite similar to the Nigerian model, except they are much more inclined to make use of the widowed backstory. And again, 81% male. Togo, Senegal, and Ivory Coast were heavily in favor of using female profiles. And Kenya was relatively a small number of contributions, but seemed to be following the Ghanaian model, which was a lot more honest and balanced in terms of gender. Asia, so the two things to discuss here. Malaysia was the third largest origin of dating fraud. Again, follows the Nigerian model, mostly male profiles. Indians, again, using the male model. We saw a large spike in profiles from India using the phrase businessman to describe themselves. And the Philippines was heavily female profiles. Unusually mixed race was prominent ethnicity, and they almost always targeted the US, with some people actually just claiming that they are in the Philippines. Very good question, Gloriana. Yeah. So there is a question about some of this stuff. There is a way to do dating, or there's a way to do online dating in this manner, which could be construed as more like an unconventional relationship, let's say. However, these are also people that will still do the kind of emotional blackmail, the stories that still extract money from you in a not an honest manner. So it's quite possible that what starts as a particular kind of arrangement turns into a sort of fraud. But you're right, there is a grey area around the criminality there. Yeah, so exactly as Ignatius says. They are quite often run by real people. There is some automation of some earlier stages. So that is a thing that we see a little bit, but they are quite often run manually. The extent to which some of this stuff is done manually is often underappreciated because we think it's not worth the time. Like, we could automate some of that work, but this is not the most technically advanced form of cybercrime. And in fact, it's a way for people who don't have a lot of technical skills to make money via the internet. I want to quickly blitz through Europe. So the UK is 93% male, so heavily male profiles. Divorced is unusually common from profiles coming from the UK. Many of the profiles, despite the fact that the UK itself is a reasonably large target for scammers, many of the profiles that claim to be that come from the UK claim to be in the US. So we see profiles claiming they're in the US that actually start in the UK, which is interesting. Then we have a bunch of the other ones here. I'll quickly highlight Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine and Russia are distinctive because they are heavily female profiles that come out of them, and they are unusually honest about their location. So they're quite happy to say that they're from the Ukraine or Russia. Even there's some evidence that even if they're using proxies, they're just using proxies to disguise their specific location within Ukraine and Russia, and not to disguise themselves internationally. Yeah, so I'm running through time. And we've hit the US, which is maybe where I'll leave this. So this again follows the Nigerian pattern, but we've got a lot of reason to be dubious about some of these profiles. So there's lots of effort we can see imitating the US location, targeting US victims, and a lot of the US located profiles actually share a lot of resources with the Nigerians and South African scam profiles. So we have some suspicion that there's an under-detected proxy problem that's feeding this. Some final cautions there, but I think I'll hand over to questions and suggestions.